What does dignity mean to you? Is it the chair you sit in, the way someone looks at you, or the simple right to be treated as an equal human being? For Elijah Cross, a respected black CEO, that question was no longer abstract. On a flight he had paid for, dressed with quiet elegance, he stepped forward to claim his first-class seat. But instead of being welcomed, he was stopped, dismissed, and handed a folding chair in the galley as if his presence didn't belong in a space he had earned. In that instant, a choice appeared before him. Stay silent and accept the insult. Lash out in anger. Or use calm precision to turn humiliation into a moment the world could not ignore. Now imagine it was you in that chair. Imagine the whispers behind you, the smug smiles in front of you, the weight of injustice pressing against your chest. What would you do? This is not just Elijah's story, it could be any of ours. Tonight, you'll see how one man's quiet strength forced an entire system to face itself. If this speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay with us as we step into the story. The morning sun spilled across the glass facade of JFK International Airport, bathing the terminal in a pale golden glow. Travelers streamed through the concourse with rolling suitcases and coffee cups, their chatter blending with the rhythmic announcements echoing over the loudspeakers. At the far end of the first-class boarding gate stood Elijah Cross. His presence was quiet but commanding. Not because of the expensive charcoal gray suit he wore, or the sleek leather briefcase in his hand, but because of the way he carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove, and yet everything to protect. Elijah was no ordinary traveler. At 45, he was the founder and CEO of Nexus Aerodyne, a technology company reshaping aviation safety across the globe. He had spent decades building his company from scratch, overcoming endless walls of doubt and bias. Today's flight to San Francisco wasn't about leisure. It was about sealing a partnership that could expand opportunities for thousands of young engineers, many from neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. Detroit's East Side, a place where dreams were often strangled before they ever took breath. To Elijah, first class wasn't about champagne or reclining seats. It was about the principle. He had paid for his ticket. He had earned his place. The digital sign above the boarding tunnel flashed SilverWing Airways, Flight 1187, boarding first class. Elijah glanced once at the sign, straightened the lapels of his blazer, and walked forward. The air inside the boarding tunnel was cooler, tinged with the scent of jet fuel and recycled air. Ahead, a young flight attendant offered a polite nod as Elijah stepped into the cabin. The space was calm, pristine rows of wide leather seats glowing under soft ambient lighting, the clink of crystal glasses, the faint rustle of newspapers, the low hum of quiet luxury. But before Elijah could reach his assigned seat, a taller man in uniform moved to block his path. The lead flight attendant. His smile was tight, rehearsed, but his eyes betrayed something else in difference. "Sir," the attendant said in a clipped voice, "I'm afraid there's been an issue with your seating." Elijah paused. "Issue?" His tone was calm. "Even—" The attendant tapped at a small tablet in his hand. "Yes. We've had an overbooking in first class. Unfortunately, your name wasn't on the primary roster. You'll need to take an alternate seat." Elijah's brows lifted slightly. "Alternate seat, I booked this 3 weeks ago. First class, seat 2A, paid in full." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled up the confirmation on his phone, and held it out. The attendant didn't even look at it. His smile sharpened, voice cooling. "Yes, but we've upgraded another guest. You'll need to sit elsewhere. We can offer a Temporary seat in the galley. Elijah blinked. For a second, he thought he had misheard. A galley seat behind the attendant. A younger crew member appeared, struggling to hold a collapsible metal chair. It looked flimsy, the kind used by maintenance staff, with a thin strap dangling loosely from one side. The young attendant avoided Elijah's eyes, his shoulders hunched in quiet shame. The lead attendant continued. "It has a seat belt. You'll be safe." The word safe landed like an insult. Elijah's eyes flicked to the rows of empty first-class seats. The cabin was far from crowded. Half the passengers were still boarding. There was no chaos, no emergency, no valid reason for what was happening. Only a quiet, deliberate humiliation. For a long moment, Elijah stood there, the weight of countless memories pressing down on him. He thought of being a boy in Detroit, turned away from a store because we don't serve your kind. He thought of his father, once forced to sit in the back of a courtroom gallery despite being the smartest man in the room. He thought of the years spent biting his tongue in boardrooms where his ideas were stolen, then repeated by someone else with lighter skin. And now, here he was, 45 years old, a billionaire CEO, being told he was not fit to sit in the seat he had paid for. Passengers began to notice. A man in a navy suit glanced over his newspaper, whispering something to the woman beside him. A young traveler smirked quietly, assuming Elijah must be some standby passenger trying his luck. The silence was louder than words. Elijah looked at the flimsy folding chair, then at the attendant who wouldn't meet his eyes. For a heartbeat, anger flared hot in his chest. He could have demanded. He could have raised his voice, called for the captain, shamed the crew right there in the aisle. But instead, Elisha breathed deeply, the way his mother had once taught him when life pressed hard against his dignity. "Son, dignity is the seat no one can take from you." He stepped aside, brushed past the attendant, and lowered himself onto the folding chair. The metal legs groaned beneath his weight, unsteady, unanchored. The strap hung loose, barely functional. The galley wall pressed cold against his back. The humiliation was complete. A few feet away, a steward pushed a beverage cart, sliding a packet of salted peanuts onto the narrow ledge beside Elijah without a word. No menu, no greeting, just silence. Elijah didn't touch it. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and drew out a sleek black tablet. With a few taps, the screen lit up. A secure channel blinked open. He typed slowly, deliberately, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. Outside, the engines roared to life, the plane pushing back from the gate. Inside, Elisha sat quietly on a folding chair, surrounded by luxury he had been denied, but holding something far greater than champagne or leather seats. He held power, and he was about to use it. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Elijah shifted slightly on the narrow folding chair, the metal pressing uncomfortably against his thighs. Every movement reminded him this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult deliberately designed to put him in his place, but he refused to show it. His posture remained steady, his eyes calm, his breathing slow. He had learned long ago that the greatest strength in the face of humiliation was composure. His mind wandered back, not to the glittering towers of New York, where his office overlooked the skyline, but to the cracked sidewalks of Detroit's East Side, where survival had been his first lesson. His mother, Lorraine, had raised him and his two younger sisters alone after his father's sudden death in a factory accident. Money was scarce, but dignity was abundant. "Son," she used to say, her hands rough from double shifts at the hospital laundry. The world will try to cut your legs out from under you. Don't let it take your pride. Pride is what keeps you walking. That voice guided him even now, as he sat exiled in the galley while strangers sipped champagne a few feet away. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he was that boy again, standing in line at a convenience store, overhearing the cashier whisper that he didn't belong. The sting never truly left. It simply reshaped itself over the years into a quiet resolve. When Elijah had founded Nexus Aerodyne in his 30s, people laughed. A black man proposing to design safety infrastructure for American aviation bankers dismissed him. Investors avoided him. Even a few government officials smirked in his presence. But he built it anyway, piece by piece, late nights fueled by black coffee and determination. And eventually, the same officials who once sneered signed contracts with Nexus. Today, his company's software monitored flight paths, compliance logs, and emergency protocols across much of the country. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very airline now humiliating him relied on technology designed by his team to keep its passengers safe. The seatbelt sign chimed. Passengers tucked away laptops and adjusted their recliners. A flight attendant offered warm towels to the first row. The scent of citrus and clean linen floated into the air. None of it reached Elijah. From his corner, he could only hear the squeak of the folding chair each time the plane bumped along the taxiway. A young girl across the aisle glanced curiously at him. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her blonde hair tied in pigtails. A stuffed rabbit clutched in her lap. She whispered something to her mother, who hushed her quickly, embarrassed. But Elijah had caught the words. "Why is that man sitting there? He looks important." He smiled faintly, though the mother avoided his eyes. Children often saw what adults refused to admit. Elijah tapped at his tablet again. To any casual onlooker, it seemed like routine work emails. But behind the darkened glass, a secure channel pulsed quietly. His fingers hovered for a moment. Should he do it now? Should he trigger the system he himself had helped design, one that could interrupt flight operations under strict compliance grounds? He hesitated. This wasn't just about pride. If he acted, the consequences would ripple far beyond this cabin. SilverWing Airways would face investigations, media firestorms, perhaps even lawsuits. People might lose jobs. And yet, what was the alternative? Another silent humiliation buried beneath polite smiles. Another wound to carry in private while the system rolled on unchecked. He glanced again at the lead attendant, who was now laughing lightly with a white passenger in seat 1C, pouring champagne with casual grace. The same hands that had shoved a folding chair at Elijah now poured luxury into crystal glasses. A flicker of anger surged in his chest. But beneath it was something heavier and ache that reached back to generations. His grandfather had told him once about segregated buses, how he'd been forced to stand while empty seats waited in the front. Don't sit, don't speak, don't exist too loudly. The rules had said. Today's setting was more polished, but the message felt the same. Elijah adjusted the strap across his lap, the cheap buckle clicking awkwardly. He thought of his employees' brilliant young coders, many of them from minority backgrounds who looked up to him as proof that resilience could break ceilings. What would it mean if he let this slide? If he accepted silence once again? The engines roared louder now, the plane turning toward the runway. A voice from the cockpit came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be departing shortly for our nonstop service to San Francisco. Estimated flight time, 5 hours and 20 minutes. Please make sure your seat belts are securely fastened." The words droned on, but Elijah hardly heard them. His mind was elsewhere, locked in a private battle. He could almost hear his mother again. The world will try to shrink you. Stand tall, even in a small place. He took a slow breath, steadied his hands, and finally tapped the sequence on his tablet. Not yet a full command, just a soft knock on the door of the system. A test ping. The signal zipped silently through encrypted channels, reaching Nexus's servers in New Jersey. Instantly, his head of security would see it. They would know their CEO was in distress. Elijah slipped the tablet back into his briefcase, closing the latch gently. On the surface, he was just another passenger preparing for takeoff. But deep inside, gears had already begun turning. The plane accelerated, pressing passengers into their seats. Elijah braced against the jolt of the folding chair, every vibration amplified by the flimsy frame. The metal rattled, a stark contrast to the smooth leather thrones a few feet away. He clenched his jaw, not out of fear, but resolve. This flight would not unfold as SilverWing had planned. From somewhere in the cabin, a phone camera discreetly captured his figure against the backdrop of the galley. Later, that footage would race across social media, a spark waiting to ignite. But Elijah didn't think about that now. He thought only of what must come next, and he knew that in less than 10 minutes, the entire balance of power in this aircraft would shift. The wheels left the runway with a heavy thud, and the aircraft lifted into the cloudy New York sky. Passengers leaned back into their plush leather seats, some sipping champagne, others already opening laptops or slipping on headphones. The atmosphere in first class was relaxed, indulgent everything Elijah Cross was denied. On his folding chair in the galley, Elijah felt the vibrations more intensely than anyone else. The metal frame shuddered each time the plane adjusted altitude. The cold wall pressed into his shoulder, the air thick with the mingled scents of reheated meals and industrial cleaners. To anyone glancing over, he looked out of place, like a worker who had mistakenly wandered into the wrong cabin. That was the intention. The lead flight attendant returned after takeoff, his tablet in hand, his expression one of quiet victory. He didn't address Elijah directly, but leaned close enough for him to hear. "Sir, I'll remind you again, this was a special circumstance. We prioritize certain guests. Thank you for cooperating." The word stung more than the chair itself. We prioritize certain guests. Elijah knew exactly what that meant. In the eyes of this crew, his money, his position, even his humanity mattered less than the color of his skin. He looked around. No other passenger had been asked to sacrifice a seat. No one else had been told they weren't on the primary roster. The lie was so thin it was insulting. Yet the silence of the other travelers was louder than the attendants' words. Some watched from the corner of their eyes, curiosity flickering across their faces. Others ignored him entirely, as though pretending he wasn't there made it acceptable. A glass of sparkling wine clinked on a tray. Laughter rippled through row 1A and 1B. The small girl who had noticed Elijah earlier still looked over occasionally. Confusion painted across her young face. Her innocence was almost painful. She could see something wrong was happening, while the adults around her feigned ignorance. Elijah's chest tightened, a mix of anger and sorrow. He had faced many kinds of prejudice in his life, but there was something uniquely degrading about being forced to endure it in silence while surrounded by luxury. It was the juxtaposition that cut deepest leather seats and gourmet meals just feet away, while he was strapped into a folding chair not meant for passengers at all. His fingers brushed over the latch of his briefcase again. Inside was the tablet, the signal already sent. His team at Nexus Aerodyne would be monitoring, waiting. He had not pulled the full trigger yet, but the wheels were in motion. He could already imagine the confusion spreading through the airline's compliance systems. Still, he hesitated. He had to weigh his actions carefully. This was not just about him. It was about every person who had ever been forced to shrink themselves in the face of power. If he pushed too hard, the media would call it overreaction. If he did nothing, the message would be clear abuse could continue unchecked. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir," the younger attendant said, "the same one who had carried the folding chair earlier?" His face was pale, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't want to." He glanced toward the lead attendant, then quickly placed a small bottle of water on Elijah's tray. His eyes darted nervously, but there was sincerity in them. Elijah gave him a nod, a subtle acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Even in this hostile space, there were cracks of humanity. The lead attendant noticed, his eyes narrowing. "Johnson," he snapped at the younger man. "Back to service. Don't linger." The authority in his tone made it clear who ruled this cabin. Johnson obeyed, shoulders tight, but not before giving Elijah one last apologetic glance. Elijah felt the knot in his stomach twist tighter. He thought of his employees again, many of them young like Johnson, often caught between speaking up and keeping their jobs. The weight of injustice was not only in the act itself, but in the way it forced others into silence. The captain's voice echoed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Flight attendants may now begin cabin service." Moments later, the aroma of roasted chicken, buttered rolls, and rich coffee drifted through the aisle. Silver trays appeared, lined with cutlery and fine china. Elijah's own tray remained empty save for the bottle of water Johnson had left. The message was clear. He would receive nothing more. He glanced at his watch. 10 minutes had passed since he had first tapped the signal on his tablet. That was all the time it would take for Nexus's servers to authenticate his distress call and flag it to aviation regulators. Somewhere, in an office hundreds of miles away, a compliance officer was staring at a red notification blinking on their screen. Section 9.3 override, triggered by Elijah Cross, Nexus Aerodyne. CEO, inside the cockpit. The pilots would soon be receiving alerts, too. Elijah knew the system well after all. He had written parts of its framework himself. The override was rare, almost mythical in the industry, a legal mechanism designed for moments when passenger safety was compromised in ways ordinary protocols couldn't address. The irony was brutal. The man humiliated into a folding chair was the very one who had helped build the safeguard that could now disrupt this entire flight. But the passengers still laughed, ate, and sipped their drinks, oblivious. To them, Elijah was just an anomaly in the corner, a man out of place. His thoughts drifted inward again. He remembered the day he first pitched Nexus to skeptical investors. He remembered standing in a polished boardroom, one man asking bluntly, "Why should we trust you with our nation's air safety?" His answer then was the same belief guiding him now, because the systems we build should protect everyone equally. A small tremor ran through the plane as it adjusted its course. Elijah steadied himself on the chair's thin arm. His composure did not waver, but inside, the storm grew louder. He was not just waiting for justice. He was waiting for history to catch up to him. Injustice, he knew, had a weight that pressed down not only on the humiliated, but on everyone who witnessed it and chose silence. That weight was pressing now, heavy in the air, suffocating in its quiet cruelty. And soon, it would break. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew began circulating with their carts. Crystal glasses tinkled. Plates slid neatly onto trays. Silver utensils caught the glow of the overhead lamps. For the passengers seated in first class, it was the familiar rhythm of luxury travel. For Elijah Cross, still perched on the narrow folding chair in the galley, every sound was a reminder of his exclusion. He had learned to master silence, to absorb humiliation without letting it consume him. Yet beneath the calm mask, his mind was a furnace of thought. He didn't just feel the injustice of this moment. He measured its consequences. He thought of the little girl who had looked at him with puzzled eyes, of Johnson, the young attendant, who had whispered an apology, of the generations before him who had swallowed indignities far greater. What was the cost of staying quiet now? Elijah shifted slightly, careful not to draw attention. His hand slid once more into his briefcase. The tablet's surface glowed to life, its secure channel still waiting. He tapped again, deliberate, slow, entering a code known to only a handful of people in the country. Section 9.3, Override. It wasn't something one stumbled upon. It was designed for the rarest of circumstances, when passenger welfare was endangered in ways too complex for normal chains of command. The code carried his signature. His name was embedded in the very framework of the system. Elijah Cross wasn't just a user, he was one of its architects. Years earlier, Nexus Aerodyne had partnered with the FAA to craft safety protocols that could bypass corporate obstruction when human dignity or safety was compromised. He remembered the late nights drafting the language, insisting that the system recognize not just mechanical failures, but human ones too. Now, here it was, the human failure in full display. At the front of the cabin, the lead attendant continued his orchestrated service, refilling champagne glasses and smiling broadly at select passengers. Elijah saw the way he glanced over occasionally, his expression smug, as though proud of how he had kept order by pushing the wrong man into his place. He had no idea what Elijah had just set in motion. Inside the cockpit, the first alert appeared on the captain's console. A red band stretched across the screen. Compliance override initiated. Section 9.3. Source Nexus Aerodyne. Elijah Cross. The captain blinked, leaning closer. His co-pilot frowned, confusion spreading across his face. What is that? Is that real? It's authentic, the captain muttered, his voice tight. His hand hovered above the controls, instinct urging him to ignore it, but training told him otherwise. It's signed. Signed by who the captain scrolled, then went pale. By him, Elijah Cross, FAA Compliance Director approved. The co-pilot glanced back toward the cabin. Wait, he's on board that Elijah Cross. The captain exhaled, a long, measured sound. Yes, and if he's triggered this, we don't have a choice. The cabin continued as though nothing had changed. Passengers laughed. Attendants poured wine. The scent of rosemary and butter wafted from the meal service. But beneath the surface, a ripple had begun to spread, invisible to those unaware. Elijah felt it too. He didn't need to see the cockpit to know what was happening. His signal had been received. The system was alive. He thought of his employees at Nexus, brilliant, stubborn young people who had once been told their work didn't matter. Together, they had built a system that gave voice to those often ignored. And now, in this cabin where his presence had been erased, the system amplified his dignity louder than any confrontation could have. The lead attendant passed near again, tossing a quick glance at Elijah as if checking that he remained compliant. He didn't notice the quiet steadiness in Elijah's eyes. He didn't see the subtle way Elijah's fingers drummed once on the arm of the chair, a sign not of impatience, but of patience fulfilled. In the cockpit, the captain picked up the intercom. His voice was steady, professional, but beneath it was a tremor. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a compliance irregularity, we have been instructed to divert this aircraft. We will be landing shortly at an alternate airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The words rippled through the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Forks froze midway to mouths. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. A murmur rose, confusion spreading quickly. "Divert? What do you mean, divert?" a man in 2C demanded. Another passenger grumbled. "This is ridiculous. We just took off." The lead attendant's face drained of color. He excused himself from row 1B and strode quickly toward the galley. His voice hushed but sharp. "Sir, what's happening? Did you—" He stopped himself, realizing even asking the question acknowledged what he didn't want to admit. Elijah didn't answer. He simply met the man's eyes. For the first time, the smug confidence cracked. The attendant swallowed, his jaw tightening, but no words came. Passengers pulled out phones. A few began recording, sensing a story unfolding. The girl with the stuffed rabbit clutched it tighter, her eyes wide, as her mother whispered calming words that carried no conviction. "In his chair." Elijah remained motionless, calm. He felt the storm swirl around him, but he did not need to raise his voice. The system, the law, and the truth were speaking louder than he ever could. He thought again of his father, who had once told him, "Power doesn't always mean shouting the loudest. Sometimes it's the quiet move no one expects." This was that moment. In less than 10 minutes, the wheels of the plane would touch down again, not in San Francisco, not at the destination passengers had expected, but at an airport chosen by the system. And when the doors opened, the balance of power would be laid bare for everyone to see. The captain's words hung in the air like an uninvited shadow. A diversion, an emergency landing. Passengers who had minutes earlier been absorbed in their entrees now sat rigid, confusion written across their faces. Forks clattered back on plates. Glasses trembled in nervous hands. The steady hum of conversation shifted into a rising tide of complaint and speculation. What compliance issue barked a man in a tailored navy suit? He slammed his glass onto the tray table, liquid splashing over his cuff. "I have a board meeting in San Francisco tonight. This is outrageous." Across the aisle, a woman clutched her pearls. "Are we in danger?" she whispered, eyes darting toward the windows as though flames might lick past the glass at any second. The young girl with the stuffed rabbit turned to her mother again, whispering more loudly this time. "Is it because of him?" Her small finger pointed, unashamed, toward Elijah sitting silently in the galley. The mother hushed her quickly, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But the question had already rippled outward. Several passengers followed the child's gaze. Elijah felt the weight of their stares settle on him like stones. He remained still, neither confirming nor denying. The truth was already in motion. He didn't need to answer. The lead attendant, pale now, hurried toward the cockpit. He disappeared behind the reinforced door, leaving Johnson and the other attendants to scramble among restless passengers. The tension was growing, simmering into anger. "Sir, can you explain what's happening?" a woman demanded. Her voice directed toward Johnson, though her eyes flicked toward Elijah. "If this isn't a safety issue, then why are we being diverted?" Johnson stammered. I don't have full details. Ma'am, please remain calm." His voice shook, betraying his own confusion. He looked toward Elijah briefly, then away again, as though acknowledging what he suspected, but dared not say aloud. The captain's voice returned, steady but edged with urgency. "We want to assure you there is no mechanical danger. This is a compliance matter that requires immediate landing. Our crew is trained for this, and your safety remains our top priority." The words were meant to reassure, but instead, they ignited more questions. Passengers turned to one another, voices overlapping. Compliance matter. What does that even mean? Is it terrorism? Smuggling? Maybe it's some kind of VIP protocol. Didn't I read something about new federal systems? Phones lifted discreetly? The man in 3D angled his camera, pretending to scroll, but capturing a shaky video of Elijah in his folding chair. Within minutes, the clip would begin circulating online, gathering momentum like dry kindling before a match. Elijah's gaze remained forward, steady. Inside, though, he felt the swell of contradiction. He hadn't wanted to create panic. This wasn't about drama. It was about dignity. But the wheels of change rarely turned quietly. The truth often came with turbulence. He shifted slightly, the chair groaning beneath him. A few passengers flinched at the sound, irrational fear leaping to conclusions. He could hear their whispers now, fragmented but sharp. Who is he? Why does he get to sit there? Something doesn't add up. The murmurs twisted into accusations, the way fear always sought a target. Elijah breathed deeply, grounding himself. He thought of his mother again, of how she used to pray quietly in the kitchen after long shifts. She had taught him that silence wasn't weakness, but discipline. He drew on that lesson now. The cockpit door opened. The lead attendant emerged, his earlier smugness replaced by a tight, forced composure. He moved quickly to the galley, leaning toward Elijah with a hushed intensity. "Sir," he said, his tone no longer sharp but laced with fear, "what exactly did you do?" Elijah met his eyes calmly. "I exercise my rights." The attendant's lips parted, searching for words, but there were none. He straightened abruptly, glancing around to see if anyone had overheard, then rushed back to the front of the cabin. His silence was an admission more damning than anything he could have said. Meanwhile, Johnson maneuvered carefully through the aisle, offering forced smiles as he collected trays half-eaten. His eyes flicked to Elijah again. Worry mingled with something else, perhaps hope. The plane began its descent sooner than expected. The engines shifted pitch, and the nose angled downward. Passengers looked around, startled. "We just took off," a voice shouted from row 4. "Why are we descending already?" The captain's voice came again. "Clip now. Prepare for landing. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." The aisles bustled with sudden urgency. Trays clattered back into carts. Glasses whisked away. Bags shoved hastily under seats. The luxury of first class evaporated, replaced by a palpable unease. No one joked now. No one asked for wine. Every face turned toward the reality they could no longer ignore. Something had forced this flight to bend, and it was no mechanical failure. Elijah sat unmoving, the straps digging into his chest as the chair rattled more violently under descent. His heart beat steady, but his thoughts were sharp, layered. He knew this was only the beginning. The real confrontation would not happen in the sky, but on the ground, when the doors opened and questions demanded answers. Yet for now, he let the silence do its work. The girl with the rabbit peeked at him once more, her small voice carrying across the hushed cabin. "Mom, is he the one keeping us safe?" Her words landed softly, but they pierced the heavy air like sunlight through clouds. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced at Elijah with something different in their eyes. Not suspicion this time, but a flicker of recognition. The descent continued, the pressure building in the cabin. Outside, the Sacramento Valley spread wide beneath the wings, the patchwork of fields and highways bathed in late afternoon light. The ground rose quickly to meet them. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Some passengers braced with white knuckles on their armrests. Others whispered frantic prayers. A few still muttered in anger, clinging to the illusion of control. But all of them, whether they admitted it or not, were now part of a moment they would never forget. Elijah lowered his eyes, exhaled slowly, and whispered words only he could hear. This is not revenge. This is reckoning. The descent grew steeper, the engines roaring in a way that made passengers clutch at their seats. Trays rattled in storage bins. Overhead compartments vibrated with the weight of luggage shifting against locks. The cabin, once filled with quiet laughter and the clink of glasses, now bristled with tension. Every eye darted around, seeking answers. Every whisper carried fear. Through the small porthole beside the galley, Elijah Cross caught a glimpse of land rising to meet them. Fields stretched in patchwork. Highways glimmered like silver threads. And then a strip of runway appeared, lined with flashing lights and the distant silhouettes of emergency vehicles. Fire trucks and federal transport vans waited at the edge of the tarmac. Elijah knew the protocol. He had designed much of it. A compliance override wasn't just a digital message. It was a summons. The landing gear clunked into place. Oxygen seemed to thin in the cabin as the wheels screeched against asphalt, jolting everyone forward. Passengers gasped. Some braced themselves. Others muttered prayers. The aircraft slowed, heavy brakes dragging against speed, until finally it rolled into a halt at a remote corner of the airport. Silence fell. No gate bridge, no welcoming terminal. Only the glow of blue lights outside and the unmistakable presence of authority waiting beyond the door. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice, tight but measured, filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed at Sacramento International under federal directive. Please remain seated. Compliance officers will be boarding the aircraft momentarily. The words triggered another round of murmurs. Some passengers protested loudly. Federal directive. What is this? Shouted a man in row 2. We have rights, another hissed under her breath. This is insane. I paid thousands for this seat. The lead attendant's face had gone white. He moved stiffly, trying to maintain composure, but his eyes betrayed panic. He had played his hand poorly, and now the game had shifted. He fussed with the curtains, avoided Elijah's gaze, and whispered harshly to Johnson to keep passengers calm. Johnson obeyed, though his eyes lingered on Elijah with a flicker of something unspoken respect, perhaps, or relief. Then came the sound, the unmistakable hiss of the cabin door unlocking. A rush of cool air swept inside, and with it, the heavy footsteps of authority. 3 figures boarded first, federal compliance officers, in navy jackets with a gold lettering. Behind them came 2 uniformed air marshals, their presence unmistakable, their expression set with seriousness. The lead officer raised his voice, projecting calm but unyielding authority. Remain seated. This is a federal matter. We require full cooperation. A ripple of fear traveled down the rows. The man in 2C, who had complained the loudest earlier, shrank back into his seat, his jaw tight but his voice silenced. Phones lowered discreetly, though many passengers still recorded behind trembling hands. The officer scanned the cabin, his eyes settling quickly on the galley. On Elijah. Mr. Elijah Cross. Elijah inclined his head, unflinching. Yes. The officer nodded once, firm and respectful. Sir, we have received your override signal. May we confirm your identity? Elijah reached into his blazer pocket and produced his identification card, embossed with the Nexus Aerodyne insignia and federal clearance codes. The officer examined it briefly, then looked up, meeting Elijah's eyes with recognition. Thank you, sir. We'll handle it from here. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers exchanged bewildered glances, realizing for the first time that the man in the folding chair was no ordinary traveler. A few leaned forward, straining to catch every word. The lead attendant tried to step forward, his voice brittle. Officer, I can explain. This gentleman there was confusion with the seating, and enough. The officer's voice cut like steel. He gestured sharply. Step aside. The attendant froze, lips parting, but the words withered in his throat. His authority evaporated in an instant. Elijah remained seated, his posture calm, his eyes fixed on the man who had humiliated him. He didn't need to speak. The truth had already been spoken by the arrival of federal boots on the aircraft floor. The officer turned again, his voice carrying through the cabin. We have received evidence of misconduct and discriminatory treatment of a passenger. We will be conducting an immediate inquiry. Passengers gasped. One woman pressed her hand to her mouth. Another muttered, discrimination in disbelief. Slowly, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The lead attendant's face twisted, color draining further. He tried to recover, his words tumbling out. This is outrageous. I was following protocol. He didn't belong in first class. His name wasn't Stop Talking. The officer's command left no room for argument. Two marshals stepped closer, and the attendant's protest shriveled into silence. Johnson, standing near the beverage cart, looked down, his hands trembling. Then, as though gathering courage, he raised his eyes and spoke softly but firmly. It's true. He had a valid ticket. Seat 2A. He showed me. I didn't stop it. I should have. But his voice cracked. But his confession hung in the air like a bell. Elijah turned slightly, meeting Johnson's eyes. For a brief moment, something passed between them, acknowledgement. Maybe even a form of forgiveness. Johnson swallowed hard, his face pale but relieved, as though releasing a weight he had carried since boarding. The officer nodded. Thank you, son. That will be noted. The lead attendant whipped his head around, fury in his eyes. You'll regret this, he hissed at Johnson. But Johnson didn't flinch. He stood straighter now, his voice steadier. No, I won't. Passengers shifted uneasily, some murmuring approval, others retreating into silence. For many, this was the first time they had seen the mechanics of injustice laid bare before them, not as an abstract debate, but as a living humiliation inflicted on a man who had done nothing wrong. The officer gestured again. Captain, secure the cabin. We will be removing certain crew members for questioning. The captain's voice crackled back over the intercom, strained but compliant. Understood. The attendants exchanged nervous glances. Two marshals stepped forward, motioning to the lead attendant and one of his colleagues, their faces twisted with protest. But they obeyed, walking stiffly down the aisle toward the open door. The lead attendant's voice carried one last desperate attempt. You'll ruin my career for this? Over a seat, Elijah finally spoke, his tone quiet but resonant, carrying to every corner of the cabin. It was never about a seat. It was about respect. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Passengers looked down, some ashamed, others thoughtful. The lead attendant was ushered out, his figure swallowed by the waiting officials beyond the door. Elisha remained in his folding chair, steady as ever. But now the balance had shifted. He was no longer the outcast in the galley. He was the center of gravity, the one whose quiet strength had drawn the world's attention to this very moment. And he knew the confrontation wasn't finished. The real reckoning was only beginning. The cabin door closed with a firm thud as the removed attendants disappeared into the waiting vehicles on the tarmac. The atmosphere inside Flight 1187 remained heavy, though it had shifted from open chaos to a strained quiet. The passengers, still strapped into their seats, exchanged hushed conversations, their earlier outrage now tinged with a strange mix of curiosity and guilt. For many, they had just witnessed something they would tell for years, a humiliation turned inside out by one man's calm defiance. Elisha sat upright in the folding chair, the thin strap digging into his shoulder. He was steady, breathing evenly, but inside his thoughts churned. He could feel the storm that was about to break. This wasn't just about a flight anymore. It was about exposing a culture that allowed quiet prejudice to fester unchecked. And for the first time, the system had bent to accountability, if only because he had forced it to. The lead compliance officer, a tall woman with clipped gray hair and a steady gaze, moved closer to Elijah. "Mr. Cross, we will need to speak with you once the passengers are disembarked. A remote crisis council has been convened with SilverWing Airways leadership. They're eager to speak with you." Elijah nodded, his eyes unwavering. "They don't want to speak with me. They want to contain this." The officer's mouth twitched, almost like she wanted to smile, but held it back. "Perhaps. But containment is a ship that has already sailed." Passengers were released in sections. Families first, then business travelers. Each group escorted past the waiting vehicles. Many tried to steal a glance at Elijah as they walked by. Some offered small nods of respect. Others looked away quickly, unable to confront their earlier silence. The little girl with the rabbit clutched it tightly and gave him a shy smile as she passed. He returned it with the faintest nod, and for a moment her innocence softened the edges of the day. When the cabin was finally empty, Elijah was escorted off last. Cameras were already positioned outside the aircraft, long lenses trained on the steps. Security personnel created a path, shielding him from the worst of the chaos. But he could hear the shouted questions. "Mr. Cross, did you force the landing? Were you discriminated against? What happened on board?" He didn't answer. Not yet. The truth would come soon, but not in the noise of a press scrum. He climbed into a black transport van that whisked him across the tarmac to a private conference room in the terminal. Inside, a large screen glowed with the faces of SilverWing executives. Their suits were immaculate, their expressions taut, as though they were speaking through clenched teeth. At the center was Lionel Carver, the airline's CEO, a man known for charm when it suited him and ruthless efficiency when it didn't. His voice came smooth but tight. "Mr. Cross," Lionel began, "we want to extend our deepest apologies for the unfortunate events on Flight 1187. This was a grave misunderstanding, and we are committed to addressing it." Elijah leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. His tone was calm, but every word carried weight. A misunderstanding is forgetting a meal order. What happened on that flight was not a misunderstanding. It was humiliation. It was prejudice. And it was enabled by a system that protects arrogance over accountability. The executives shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat as though to interject, but Elijah's gaze silenced him. Lionel tried again, his voice smooth. "We understand your frustration. The employees responsible have already been suspended pending investigation. Rest assured, this is not the culture we stand for." Elijah's jaw tightened. Not the culture you stand for, or not the culture you admit to when the cameras are rolling. The gray-haired compliance officer seated beside Elijah turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing at the screen. Even she seemed to relish the truth he was forcing into the open. Lionel exhaled sharply, abandoning charm for bluntness. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Cross?" For a moment, silence filled the room. Elijah's thoughts flashed to the other passengers, to Johnson's trembling confession, to the countless names he'd read in reports of people denied dignity on planes, in offices, in boardrooms. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressed down, but this time, he wasn't going to carry it quietly. "I want more than apologies," Elijah said. "I want reform." The word hung there, heavy. He leaned in closer, his voice low but piercing. "Here are my terms. 1, a full audit of your first-class protocols, upgrade systems, and complaint records, conducted by an independent body. 2, mandatory bias and de-escalation training for every crew member. Not as a box-check exercise, but designed and overseen by Nexus Aerodyne. 3, quarterly public accountability reports, real transparency, not PR gloss. And 4, he paused, letting the tension build. Whoa! A passenger dignity council, composed of travelers, advocates, and your own staff, with authority to review and intervene in cases like this. The executives exchanged frantic glances, whispers breaking through the call. Lionel's face tightened. "Those are significant demands. They're necessary demands," Elijah countered. "You grounded a plane because I pulled a lever you helped me build. Imagine what happens when ordinary people without that lever are treated the same way. You don't get to bury this in silence." Lionel's mask cracked, frustration spilling through. "Mr. Cross, you're asking us to dismantle decades of operation." Elijah cut in, his voice firm but never raised. "I'm asking you to honor decades of human dignity you've ignored." The silence that followed was profound. On the screen, faces twitched with discomfort. The weight of his words pressed against them, undeniable. Finally, Lionel exhaled, his voice quieter now. "We will need to consult the board." Elijah leaned back, his gaze steady. "Do that, but understand every moment you delay. The story outside grows larger. Your passengers are already talking. Their videos are already spreading. The world is watching, and it won't be patient." The call ended in uneasy silence. Elijah sat still, the gray-haired officer watching him with a kind of restrained admiration. "You don't fight loud," she said softly. "You fight exact." Elijah allowed himself the faintest smile. Loudness fades. Precision endures. Later that evening, while officials still worked through statements and the airline scrambled behind closed doors, Elijah found himself standing near a window overlooking the runway. Aircraft lights blinked in the distance. Engines roared. Life continued. But he knew something had shifted. The folding chair in the galley wasn't just humiliation. It was a symbol. Already, images were spreading online, captions multiplying. Respect isn't a privilege. It's standard. Elijah's phone buzzed. A message from his communications chief at Nexus Aerodyne. "We're trending. Hashtags are climbing. Do you want us to release the footage?" He stared at the screen, considering. The footage wasn't just his shield. It was a mirror, one the world needed to see. He typed slowly, carefully. "Yes, but release it with the truth, not with anger." Show them what dignity looks like under fire. As the message sent, Elijah exhaled deeply. He knew the battle had only begun, but for the first time in years, he felt the weight shifting, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in a seat they had already earned. By dawn the next morning, the story had already eclipsed anything SilverWing Airways could hope to contain. The video, carefully released by Elijah's communications team, spread like fire on dry grass. Clips stitched together from passengers' shaky footage and the quiet strength of Elijah's recorded stream painted a story too stark to deny a black man, dressed sharply in a navy blazer, sitting in a folding galley chair while others dined in first class. The captions wrote themselves: denied dignity, forced to prove humanity. Another showed the young girl with the rabbit, her voice captured faintly asking, "Is he the one keeping us safe?" That line became the heartbeat of the movement, shared and reposted under a growing tide of hashtags. Sate 2A. Respect is standard. Flying while black. Morning talk shows dissected the story with urgency. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. One commentator said, he simply let the system he helped design hold a mirror up to the prejudice baked into the airline's culture. That's not just poetic justice, it's structural justice. In homes across America, people watched the footage with mixed emotions. Some winced with recognition, remembering their own humiliations dismissed as misunderstandings. Others, who had never been confronted with such raw inequity, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, forced to see what they had long ignored. At the SilverWing headquarters in Chicago, Lionel Carver paced in his glass-walled office as board members streamed in, their faces grim. "We are hemorrhaging public trust." One snapped. "The calls haven't stopped. Investors are furious. The government wants answers by noon." Lionel slammed a hand against the desk. "Do you think I don't know that?" His voice cracked, the polished calm from the night before gone. He gestured to the wall of screens displaying news anchors, hashtags, and live coverage of protesters already gathering outside terminals. This has become a wildfire. Meanwhile, Elijah stayed in Sacramento under federal advisement, occupying a quiet suite at the Terminal Hotel. He avoided the chaos of interviews, choosing silence over noise. Instead, he focused inward, writing notes by hand in a small leather journal he carried everywhere. His thoughts spiraled between duty and fatigue. He had not sought this stage, but perhaps he had been carried here by something larger than himself. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Johnson. The young attendant had found the courage to reach out. "Sir, I don't know if this will reach you. I just want to say thank you for standing firm, for not letting me stay silent. I've been afraid for so long to speak up. You showed me it's possible." Elijah read the message twice, feeling its weight. He thought back to Johnson's trembling confession on the plane, the moment he had chosen truth over complicity. Perhaps this was how change always began, not with sweeping speeches, but with small acts of courage that rippled outward. Later that afternoon, a federal press conference was called. Cameras crowded the briefing room as the gray-haired compliance officer stood at the podium. Her words were firm, deliberate. Yesterday, Flight 1187 was diverted under federal compliance protocols following verified evidence of discriminatory misconduct. Our investigation is ongoing, but let it be clear no passenger should ever be denied dignity in flight. This office will ensure accountability. Reporters pressed for details, but she gave none. Yet her restrained tone carried more force than outrage could. The system itself had spoken, and that alone sent shockwaves through the industry. Outside, The protests swelled. At JFK, at LAX, at Chicago O'Hare. Travelers carried signs, all seats earned, all faces welcome. At Sacramento, where Elijah remained, demonstrators gathered with folding chairs painted gold, lifting them high like emblems of defiance. Elijah watched from the window of his hotel suite, the chants echoing faintly even through glass. It humbled him, unsettled him. He had never wanted to be a symbol, yet now, unwillingly, he was one. That evening, his communications chief, a sharp-minded woman named Talia, urged him to speak publicly. The story is out there, but if you don't give it your voice, others will fill the silence. They'll twist it into anger, or pity, or spectacle. You need to anchor it in truth. Elijah leaned back, weary. And what is truth to people who only see me as a headline? Talia's gaze softened. Then show them more. Show them the man who sat in silence, because his dignity was stronger than their mockery. He exhaled, staring at his hands. The memory of the folding chair burned in his chest, not just the discomfort of its steel frame, but the humiliation of being told he didn't belong where he had paid to sit. He thought of his mother again, how she used to whisper, "Your silence is not your erasure. It is your preparation." Finally, he nodded. Prepare the statement. The next morning, Elijah stood before a podium set in a quiet conference room, cameras humming softly, lights flooding his face. He began not with fire, but with stillness. "I boarded Flight 1187 with a valid ticket for Seat 2A. He said simply. Instead, I was told I did not belong. I was told to sit in a folding chair meant for staff, not passengers. I complied not because I accepted humiliation, but because I knew silence can be louder than protest." His voice was calm, each word deliberate. "What happened on that flight is not just about me. It is about every traveler who has been told they are less. It is about every voice silenced by fear of losing a job, a seat, a chance. Yesterday, I used a lever I helped design to ensure the system listened. But many do not have that lever. For them, dignity remains negotiable. That must end." He paused, letting the silence breathe. Cameras clicked like rain. Reporters leaned in, but he did not rush. "SilverWing Airways has a choice," Elijah continued. "It can deny and deflect, or it can confront the culture that allowed this to happen. My demands are clear, independent audits, training rooted in humanity, transparency that cannot be buried, and a passenger dignity council to ensure no one is silenced again. These are not punishments. They are the minimum price of justice." He looked straight into the lens, his eyes steady. Respect is not a luxury. Respect is standard. And if an airline cannot understand that, it does not deserve to fly. The room erupted in questions, but Elijah stepped away from the podium, leaving his words to echo. Online, within minutes, his speech was clipped, shared, subtitled in multiple languages. The phrase "respect is standard" became a rallying cry, plastered across timelines and news tickers at SilverWing's headquarters. Lionel Carver watched the broadcast with his board. His jaw clenched as the chants outside his office grew louder, audible even through glass. Investors were already threatening to pull contracts. Politicians were calling for hearings. He realized then that this wasn't about weathering a scandal. It was about survival. And Elijah knew, as he closed his leather journal that night, that the tide had turned. The reckoning was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to move, to wait, to accept less. The boardroom at SilverWing headquarters felt less like a temple of power, or more like a war bunker. The windows were drawn, the mahogany table cluttered with half-empty coffee cups and printouts of financial forecasts bleeding red. Outside the tower, protesters crowded the streets, their chants faint but relentless, seeping through even the thickest glass. Folding chairs painted gold appeared like banners in the sea of voices. Lionel Carver sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. He scanned the room of executives, all fidgeting under the pressure. "We're facing annihilation," one finance officer muttered. "Our stock dropped 22% overnight. Lenders are calling. Government contracts are on pause. We cannot afford another day of this." Lionel rubbed his temples. "What do you propose? That we hand over the keys to Cross? That we let him dictate operations?" "He doesn't want operations," another executive said carefully. "He wants accountability. If we resist, we lose everything. If we concede, at least we survive." Lionel's jaw clenched, the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue. He had built his career on never bowing to pressure. But this was different. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a movement. And it was bigger than him. That afternoon, under federal urging, a negotiation was scheduled. Elijah Cross arrived at the neutral site, an austere federal building in Washington, ODC, escorted by the same gray-haired compliance officer. He wore no tie, only a dark blazer over an open-collared shirt. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the stiff, anxious executives waiting inside. Lionel rose when Elijah entered, his face stretched into a strained smile. "Mr. Cross," he began, voice rehearsed. "Thank you for meeting us. Let me again extend my personal regret." Elijah raised a hand, cutting him off without hostility but with finality. "This isn't about regret. Mr. Carver, this is about responsibility." The compliance officer gestured for everyone to sit. "We are here to determine corrective measures that will satisfy federal standards, public demand, and, most importantly, justice." For a moment, the room settled into an uneasy quiet. Papers shuffled. Pens clicked nervously. Elisha sat still, his journal resting closed on the table. Then he spoke. "You grounded an aircraft not because of weather, not because of a mechanical fault, but because one man was denied the seat he had paid for because of the color of his skin. That humiliation is now the face of your airline. You cannot PR your way out of this." Lionel leaned forward, trying to reclaim ground. "Mr. Cross, we are prepared to offer a substantial settlement, along with a personal apology. We believe this can close the matter swiftly." Elijah's eyes didn't waver. "You believe money closes dignity. That's the culture that put me in a folding chair. I'm not here for a settlement. I'm here for systemic reform." The words landed like a strike. Executives exchanged uneasy glances, whispers darting across the table. The compliance officer leaned in, her voice firm. "He's right. Public trust cannot be bought. It has to be rebuilt." Elijah opened his journal, flipping to a page filled with notes. His voice carried, calm but resolute. "Here are my terms. They are not requests. They are conditions of survival for your airline." He laid them out one by one. First, independent audits, with findings made public. Second, training programs not designed by you, but by independent experts and my company, Nexus Aerodyne, will oversee their implementation. Third, quarterly transparency reports accessible to every passenger, not buried in fine print. And fourth, the creation of a Passenger Dignity Council, with seats reserved for ordinary travelers, not executives, to ensure every voice is heard. Lionel bristled. This is unprecedented. You're asking us to let outsiders control our internal operations." Elijah met his gaze steadily. "You asked passengers to trust you with their lives at 30,000 feet. That trust has been broken. You no longer get to police yourself." The room fell into silence. Even Lionel had no quick retort. The compliance officer finally spoke. "Mr. Carver, with the government watching and your passengers in open revolt, these terms are your lifeline. Refuse, and the consequences will be catastrophic." For a long moment, Lionel sat frozen, the weight of decades of pride pressing down. Then, slowly, he exhaled, "We'll agree, with modifications." Elias shook his head. "No modifications. Not this time." The standoff stretched like a taut wire. Finally, Lionel slumped back in his chair, defeated. "Fine. We'll agree." The officer nodded sharply. "Then it's settled. A formal document will be drafted within 48 hours. The meeting adjourned, but the storm outside had only grown. Protesters chanted louder as Elijah stepped out of the building. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust toward him. He paused at the top of the steps, sunlight catching his face, and spoke just one line that would echo across headlines by nightfall. "This is not victory for me. This is dignity for everyone." The crowd roared in response, voices rising like thunder. Some raised folding chairs overhead. Others lifted signs. But all carried the same truth: something had changed, and it could not be undone. That night, Elias sat alone in his hotel room, exhaustion pulling at him. He wrote in his journal by lamplight, his words steady though his body ached. Power without humility corrupts. Dignity without defense fades. Today, we chose both power and dignity. Tomorrow, we must keep choosing them. His phone buzzed again, another message from Johnson. "I watched your speech. For the first time in years, I feel proud to wear this uniform. Thank you." Elijah closed his eyes, letting the weight of those words sink in. Perhaps this was how justice began, not with triumph, but with one life changed, then another, until the tide turned for all. Weeks passed, but the echoes of Flight 1187 did not fade. Instead, they grew louder, threading through conversations in boardrooms, living rooms, and congressional halls. SilverWing Airways, once a titan of luxury travel, now carried a scar that demanded healing. And at the center of it all, Elijah Cross found himself not only a witness, but a reluctant architect of change. The reforms he demanded were codified swiftly under the watchful eyes of both government and public. SilverWing released its first public statement outlining the new Passenger Dignity Council, audits already underway, and the introduction of training programs created in partnership with Nexus Aerodyne. For the first time in the airline's history, ordinary passengers sat at the same table as executives, shaping policy rather than being silenced by it. The world reacted with mixed emotions. Some praised the measures as groundbreaking, overdue accountability in an industry notorious for arrogance. Others accused Elijah of overreach, of humiliating a company to elevate his own profile. Elijah paid them no mind. He knew the truth. This was not about ego, but equity. At his office in Atlanta, Nexus Aerodyne buzzed with new energy. Journalists requested interviews daily, investors lined up to back projects, and advocacy groups begged for his voice at their events. Elijah turned down most offers, choosing instead to focus on substance. He spent hours with his engineers, refining compliance systems that could protect passengers worldwide, ensuring no one would need to pull a hidden lever to be treated with dignity again. Yet even as his company thrived, Elijah carried the memory of that folding chair with him. In quiet moments, he would sit in silence and replay it, the sharp metal beneath him, the stares of strangers, the little girl's question about safety. He knew it would never leave him, and maybe it shouldn't. One crisp autumn morning, Elijah returned to Sacramento International Airport. The terminal buzzed with normalcy travelers rolling bags, families saying goodbyes, the smell of coffee wafting through the concourse. But near Gate C-12, a new installation caught his eye. There, beneath a large window overlooking the runways, stood a single folding chair painted white, encased in glass. A plaque beneath it read, "Respect is not a privilege, it is standard, in honor of every passenger who demanded dignity." Travelers paused to read, some snapping photos, others nodding solemnly before continuing on their way. Elijah stood before it, hands in his pockets, his chest heavy with emotion. He hadn't known the airport planned this tribute. It was not his doing. It was theirs, the people who had carried the message forward. As he turned to leave, he noticed Johnson standing a few feet away, now in a crisp new uniform, shoulders straighter, eyes brighter. "Mr. Cross," he said, a quiet smile breaking across his face. Elijah returned the smile. "Genuine. Johnson. How are you holding up better?" the young man replied. "I thought they'd fire me for speaking out. Instead, they promoted me, said they want people who won't stay silent." He paused, voice catching. "That's because of you." Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Johnson, that's because of you. You chose truth. Don't forget that." The young attendant nodded, eyes misty, before being called away by a colleague. Elijah watched him go, pride mingled with humility. Change wasn't measured in headlines or contracts, it was in people like Johnson, standing taller because they finally knew they could. That evening, Elijah boarded another flight, this time on a competitor airline. He sat quietly in seat 2A, the very seat he had been denied weeks earlier. As the engines hummed and the plane lifted into the night sky, he gazed out the window at the city lights shrinking below. A woman beside him, perhaps in her 50s, leaned over slightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, recognition dawning in her eyes. "You're him, aren't you? The man from the chair?" Elijah chuckled gently. "That's what they're calling me now." Her face grew serious. "Thank you. My son was told once that he didn't belong in a classroom he'd earned his way into. He never forgot that shame. Watching you, it gave him hope." Elijah's chest tightened. He nodded slowly. "Tell him it's not about what they say. It's about who he chooses to be when they're wrong." For the rest of the flight, he sat in quiet reflection, the hum of the engines steady beneath him. He thought of his mother's prayers, of the young girl's innocent question, of Johnson's trembling confession, of Lionel Carver's reluctant surrender. All threads in a tapestry he hadn't meant to weave, but one that now stretched far beyond him. Weeks later, Elijah was invited to testify before Congress. Cameras flashed as he walked into the chamber, but he carried himself with the same quiet composure he had in the folding chair. His testimony was not fiery, but precise. He spoke of dignity, of systemic change, of ensuring no traveler, worker, or citizen was forced to beg for humanity. His words carried across party lines, across oceans, into hearts. Months after that, an international coalition of airlines adopted a new framework, dubbed informally the Cross Protocol. Its core principle was simple: dignity as standard, training programs, accountability councils, transparency audits. What had begun as demands in a crisis were now becoming law. Elijah never called it his victory. He called it survival. survival of respect in a world too quick to discard it. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, he returned home to Atlanta. Sitting on his porch, journal open on his lap, he wrote the final entry of that chapter. Sometimes change begins in silence, in the moment you refuse to move from the place you belong, and sometimes that silence is so loud, it forces the world to land and listen. He closed the book, set it aside, and let the evening sun warm his face. The battle was not over, justice never was, but for now. He allowed himself to breathe, knowing the tide had turned at its heart. The story of Elijah Cross is not only about a CEO denied a seat, it is about the dignity every person deserves, no matter their wealth, color, or status. Life often puts us in situations where our worth is questioned, not always on a plane, but in workplaces, families, or communities. In those moments, it can be tempting to stay silent, to avoid confrontation, to just let it go. But Elijah's story reminds us that silence can also be a form of strength when it is used with purpose. He chose not to scream, but to act with precision, showing that true power lies in calm conviction, not in loud retaliation. For older audiences especially, this resonates deeply. We have all lived through times when dignity was overlooked, when respect had to be demanded. The lesson here is clear. Dignity is not negotiable. We must create systems, families, and communities where respect is the standard, not a privilege. And even when we are denied that respect, we can turn pain into a force for change. Elijah's story is a call to each of us to choose dignity, to defend it, and to leave behind a world where the next generation won't have to fight for it. Thank you so much for watching and for sharing your time with us. If this story moved you, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories of justice, dignity, and hope to life.